There's no shortage of headlines right now about global uncertainty, geopolitics, inflation, and shifting trade dynamics. But for businesses, the real question is, what does this actually mean for demand and for growth? Because what we're seeing is that while the environment is complex, opportunity hasn't disappeared. It's just become harder to read and harder to win. So today we're going to unpack both sides of that. What's happening at the macro level and how that's actually showing up in customer behaviour. Joining me in the room is Dr. Paul Grimes, the CEO of Austrade, and joining us remotely is Makenna Ralston, the CEO of Commbank IQ. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Gary.
Now, Paul, I'm going to start with you, the first question. So what are the 2 to 3 biggest macro forces shaping global e-commerce right now?
Yeah, Gary, I think you actually covered it in the way you framed the session. You know, the 3 big ones that I would call out is, first of all, macroeconomic factors, geopolitical factors, and then technology. And all 3 relate to each other. On geopolitical factors, the tectonic plates are shifting. The global geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting, and that's having significant implications for supply chains. Supply chains are being disrupted, they're adjusting, they're being remade as we speak right now. So it's a time of great change. We know when tectonic plates move, a lot of action happens, and that's exactly what we're seeing in the world. Of course, what's happening macroeconomically is completely related to that as well. So that we're seeing the macroeconomic effects of those geopolitical tectonic plates clashing together, and very starkly at the moment, the impacts that that's having on energy prices and how that flows right through the economy. And of course, you called it out, that impacts on consumers. You know, consumers are not immune. In fact, they're feeling these effects really directly now, and that's having real implications for the competitive environment. And then overlaying it all, of course, is we've got this really profound technological change, particularly driven by AI, not just AI, robotics and other areas where we're seeing quite stunning changes. But I think for top of mind for everyone on this webinar today will be the impacts of AI and how that's shaping the business landscape.
Okay, so I guess that's a perfect storm almost.
It's almost a perfect storm.
Yes.
It creates great challenge, but also opportunity.
And Makenna, I guess I'll throw to you. From a data perspective, are you seeing these same forces show up in how consumers are then actually spending?
Thanks, Gary. And well, we are going global today. It is important to keep an eye on what's happening here in Australia. Our strength in Commbank IQ is a deep understanding of the Australian consumers through banking transaction data. So what we're looking at here is not surveys, not samples of behavior, but the actual spending of 7 million Australians, which we aggregate to be nationally representative. And what we're seeing in that data is that consumer spending is remaining relatively resilient overall. Total spending is holding up for the moment. We are not seeing a broad-based pullback at this stage. So, for example, total retail spending is up about 5% year on year. That's not channel specific. But importantly, it's also been stable in the last month or so with all of these changing circumstances. So we saw that total retail sales growth across March up 5.1% year on year. So yes, customers are spending more on the likes of fuel. That was 16% up year on year in March. But the increased spend on essentials is not yet materially displacing discretionary spending. So what we're seeing is a hold, but that could change over time.
Really interesting, the difference between what we read in the media about consumer sentiment, but what they're actually doing. That's very interesting. Okay, Paul, I may throw back to you then. So certainly Australia Post feels this in terms of trade policy and particularly tariffs, and they just seem to be becoming more complex again. I just saw in the US Postal Service again talking about changes that the administration's looking at for postal deliveries. So what are the sort of key changes businesses need to understand when they're thinking about entering a new market, as they think about the trade policy and tariffs?
Yeah, in the current environment, business has to be constantly surveying and monitoring what's changing in the trading rules environment for their business. And it doesn't seem that a week goes by where there isn't another major headline, some other development in the world that business is going to have to grapple with. Of course, one of the key things that we are responsible for at Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, is making sure that there's good information available for businesses to navigate through this complex and changing environment, whether it be the trade rules themselves or indeed implications for our freight and logistics services as well.
And so I'm sure a lot to consider, and I guess with the pace of change, you're having to keep that for a smaller business, keeping across that. Austrade can help in terms of staying right up on what's changing day to day. But where do businesses typically become unstuck when they're navigating international expansion in the environment we're in right now?
One of the key ways that you can become unstuck is not keeping abreast of developments. And look, it's completely understandable that a small business might not be able to dedicate a lot of time every day to monitoring everything that's happening. That's why it's important to be reaching out for partners who might be able to help you and advisors that can help you and navigate through this environment. You come unstuck if you're not actively looking and monitoring the developments in the markets that you're participating in.
It's interesting, there was a little bit of complexity when what people refer to as the Trump tariffs came in, and some of even the tech changes for businesses here to start shipping to the US again, and some product getting returned as they first set up. So it just changes so rapidly. So with that in mind, how should business think about products in the markets they go after? So I'm a business, that thinking about expanding globally, and I'm sure one answer would be to talk to Austrade, but how do they think about just how I prioritise which markets I'd go after?
So I think prioritise a market where you feel that is well matched to your capabilities and your understanding of that market. For every business, it'll be a different answer, of course, but best to be focused on those markets where you have an understanding of the market. You can be confident that you're going to be able to monitor and stay abreast of changes, and more importantly, that you've got a product that is going to satisfy the needs of that market. Okay,
great. And I guess also that's Austrade is there to help.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'll turn to Makenna now. So, Makenna, as I said, it's interesting reading the media narrative of slowdown, but what you just said earlier, the data suggests something a little more nuanced. So what are you actually seeing in the consumer spending right now?
Yeah, there sure is that narrative, but as I said earlier, whilst we're seeing general resilience in the Australian spending overall, we are seeing lower growth rates in selected discretionary categories. So, for example, people are starting to pull back on bulk and home categories, and we're also seeing some downward movement in travel-related categories, which makes sense, particularly airlines. So airlines were down 6.5% year on year in March this year compared to last year. But that trend is not occurring across the total volume of spend in the whole wallet yet. But what we are seeing across the wallet is a change in how people spend. And most importantly, that's a continued shift towards online behavior. Online spending reached $82.6 billion in sales last retail. That accounts of 24% of total spending. So the demand is absolutely there, but we are seeing smaller, more frequent online purchases, and consumers are spreading their spend across more retailers. So now there's almost 16 retailers per household in the spending behavior. And that means it's likely driven by discount-led buying, by shifts to private label, and use of subscription benefits. And that tells us that while people aren't spending less overall, they are being more deliberate in how they spend, how they allocate those decisions. So whilst there's no overall slowdown story yet, there's absolutely shifts that's happening in behavior, and particularly to and within the online channel.
So if that's the case and demand is still there, but it sounds like harder to win, what does that mean for how you think businesses need to show up differently?
Absolutely. Well, I think let's start with the punchline, right? There is still strong demand, but it's distributed. If consumers are shopping more frequently across more retailers, that means there are more opportunities to win that transaction, but there's also more competition every time a customer makes a decision. And we're seeing timing play a bigger role. Spend is increasingly concentrated around key moments that matter, particularly promotional periods, Black Friday, Christmas sales, etc. But it's important to also remember that not all customers are shopping the same, and brands very much need to consider how do they shape their strategy for different generations, different locations. So, for example, in the AusPost report, we can see that millennials contributed the most spend online last year out of all the generations. That's nearly 30 billion. And it's not just about the age range, it's also about where the shopper is based that needs to be considered. So yes, consumers in capital cities accounted for 75% plus of all online spend last year, but nearly 10% or 7 billion of total online spend came from consumers in outer regional or remote areas. And those remote customers grew their online spend more year on year than those in the capital cities. So consumers, whether they're regional or otherwise, they are looking for the best price and they are looking for a more convenient shopping experience. And it's important to note that pure online marketplaces, Amazon, Temu, etc., they contributed 23% of total online spending in 2025. That's 18.9 billion. And that underscores their value proposition in a digital growing Australia. Competitive pricing, vast product assortment, one-stop shop. So the challenge for businesses here, not just generating demand, but showing up at the right time, in the right place, and making it the most convenient shopping experience possible.
All right, that's really interesting. So it sounds like on the one hand, we've got increasing global complexity, and it's just moving at a rate of knots. And the other, a customer who's still spending, but just being far more deliberate. So look, I'd love to bring that together. And a final question to you both, and I'll start with you, Paul. So if you're an Australian business looking to expand in the next 6 to 12 months, what's the first thing you should be doing right now?
First thing is make sure that you've properly assessed your readiness to enter into markets and maintain those markets. But I would say from an Austrade perspective, go to the Go Global Toolkit. It's a fantastic web resource for all businesses, and it's a great entry point to understand what are the current rules that are applying to different markets around the world.
And that's sort of global, around the world.
It's around the world, and also it gives you those contact points. If you need further advice, you need to reach out for further advice. It gives you that link point into further advice. So the Go Global Toolkit, that's the one to remember, and the great place to start at.
And on that, I know for when I talk to small businesses, it's a bit of a black hole. And so starting with the Go Global Toolkit, at least trying to decipher where I may start, because it's just so hard to know when you're starting from scratch.
That's exactly right. You've got to find that entry point, that connection point, and also other resources are there and other points of contact, including contacting Austrade directly.
Right.
And we can then link you in with the appropriate trade specialists.
Fantastic. Okay, and Makenna, the same question to you, just around what should you be doing? And then, if you're looking to expand, where would you go? What's the first thing you'd be doing, suggesting?
I just think it is so critical for business leaders to really understand how demand is showing up for their consumers in their markets. Strong expansion or strategic choices, they need to be grounded in real demand signals. As we've talked about, it is noisy out there in terms of the sentiment or the feeling that we all have. But you need to make sure your assumptions or perceived ideas about market opportunity are grounded in a real understanding of customer. And you do that through data. I know I'm biased on that, but when the world is shifting so fast and there are different signals that might be real or perceived, you really need to turn to the data to understand what is happening right now with your customers. How is that changing or not changing? And base those big, important strategic decisions in the real data, in real behavior. And that's what we bring to life at Commbank IQ. But I think now more than ever, there's opportunity out there, but it needs to be grounded in fact.
Great. Well, thank you. And I have to say, just as I mentioned earlier, the sentiment out there versus the data, there does seem to be a bit of a gap at the moment, because suggesting that demand is still there. It's just where is it and how do I chase it down? So look, I think thank you both. I think the key takeaway from today's discussion is this: that demand hasn't disappeared. It's just being redistributed. And what we're seeing is a more deliberate, more selective customer and a more complex global operating environment. So for Australian businesses, hopefully who've joined us today, that means success internationally isn't just about where you go, but how well you understand both the external landscape and what's really happening with your customers. So a big thank you to Dr. Paul Grimes, to Makenna Ralston for sharing such valuable insights today. I really appreciate your time and perspective.